Okay, we're ready for our special guest presentation again, and it's going to be from Lisa Cleckner, the director of the environment of the Finger Lakes Institute. She's going to talk about the environmental health of the Finger Lakes watersheds and an overview of the Institute's research and their education programs. Take it away.
Okay, well, thank you, Roxy and CWIO for having me this evening. I've got a couple of screens here, so including a really tiny one that I'm speaking from with the mic, with the camera. So I'm going to do a little Zoom magic here and see if I can get the right window in the right place. And then I will start the show here. So one step at a time. And I can't talk and do this at the same time. So
Need me to delay some more. We usually pick on Doug for whatever color he's wearing today.
just seem to have a little bit of a delay in the screen. So let me just, I'm going to go to full screen and also knock something else out.
And I think everyone knows, but sometimes you can probably lose track and forget this, but the Finger Lakes Institute houses our watershed manager for us, which is wonderful. Thank you very much. And so it gives Isaac a really nice place to work, and it also lets him work right next to Ian Smith, the Seneca Lake watershed manager. And so they can collaborate, share ideas. I think we get a lot of synergy out of that relationship. But there's a lot more to the Institute, which we will hear.
Great. Thanks. Thank you, Roxy. And so I'm just going to go ahead and click this and hope that the slide that I think is there is there. Is there a full screen environmental health slide, or is there something else?
We can see your little slides off to the side. It's not it's okay, but it's not.
Yeah, no, that's not what I want. So, okay. Why don't you tell one more little anecdote and then I'll be right with you.
Oh my goodness. Darby, you have any stories? Good for a story.
Well, I was going to make an announcement later. I'll just do it now that the Water Resources Institute of Tompkins County, we have a couple committees that want to work on some outreach for the TMDL. Figure this is a good group to talk to about that. And so we put together a very, very short survey, just asking people topics that they would be interested in learning more about, whether it's for outreach or training. And so we just sent that around to the municipalities in Tompkins County, but I'll share it with you guys too, in case you're interested. Lisa, I think you just need to hit the slideshow.
Yeah, I just did. I'm going to move this back over. I've got this new setup here.
Oh, that's gigantic.
Oh, God.
There you go.
Is it really big?
Well, it just says slideshow.
The slideshow, resume slideshow as one giant icon.
Like that.
Yikes. Okay, sorry. Let me just click out of this for 1 second. Come right back in.
And I think I'm rubbing off on you, Darby. It's the Water Resources Council in Tompkins County, not the Water Resources Institute in Tompkins
Did I say
County.
Institute?
You did. You totally pulled a Roxy. Yeah, so don't be confused.
Well, I'm working with someone who works at the Water Resources Institute on it.
Right, of course. So I guess I should send that out in a MailChimp so that everyone gets that too. Right?
No, I mean, no offense, but I'm not interested in what other people in other counties want to do. But I've already set it out to our Tompkins County people.
All right.
All right. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to share a screen and then I'm going to turn my camera off if that works for y'all.
Sure, that's fine.
Okay. All right. Because this is, I have two very different size monitors. Let's just leave it at that. And it gets a little dicey in the switching back and forth. So.
Emma, while Lisa's getting that finished up. Margaret's still not getting the agendas, and she's put some other email addresses to try in the chat. You could check those out tomorrow or whenever. That'd be great.
How are we looking?
Looks
Perfect.
great.
All right. I'll try to move a window. Thanks. And sorry for the technical glitch. You know, the academics are always the worst at this. So apologies, but we're going to get rolling here. Just going to give a very quick overview about some of the environmental programs that the Finger Lakes Institute has. I want to talk a little bit about environmental health. My background is as an environmental health scientist, and I just want to remind and take a bigger picture view of some of the issues that we regularly talk about every day. And thinking of the health aspects of these and how we assess, you know, the relative risk of some of these risks that we face every day, and put that in the context of harmful algal blooms and some contaminants specifically related to fish. And so before I get started into the environmental health aspects, I think people know that we're in Geneva, and thank you, Roxy, for the introduction of, you know, some of the things that we do. We've been around now for 20 years and, you know, just do a lot of work between campus and community. One of the biggest things that we try to do is to translate knowledge and research about the Finger Lakes environment into collaborative action. So that means that we work with a number of partners, including the intermunicipal organizations such as this, the Watershed associations, as well as many academic institutions. And one of the other big things that we try to do often is to pursue grant dollars. And we have been successful in bringing in a lot of grant money to combat invasive species. I know when I first started, I saw Roxy down in Watkins Glen with Senator Schumer doing, you know, just explaining to him about hydrilla and when it was first discovered. And subsequently, we were able to get funding for the Finger Lakes Prism. And we were able to get some federal grants to continue a lot of the outreach and the fundraising that was started by, you know, a lot of people involved in this organization. So that's one of the main things that we do is, you know, try to bring partners together, get grant money, and to move the research agenda and the, I'd say, control efforts if it's invasive species forward. We do have 4 different kind of initiatives or program areas at the Institute. We, you know, in addition to research, we have K through 12 education. We do a lot of outreach, but then very generally to not only meetings like this, but to scientists. We hosted the 2025 Finger Lakes Research Conference a couple of months ago on campus. And then, as Roxy mentioned, we also housed a couple of watershed managers or watershed stewards, Ian Smith and Isaac. Picture of our current staff who's in the building. There's a lot of people that do invasive species, a lot of people that are supported by soft money, but we have been able to keep a pretty solid group here together for a long time. And I'm really grateful. A lot of the, you know, pretty much everything I'm presenting here, except for when it's from our collaborators, is certainly possible because of our staff. And I just want to thank them. So I think we all know this. This is preaching a little bit to the choir, but I do believe that the lakes are the bedrock of the economy for our region, in addition to tourism. I mean, agriculture clearly depends on water, and Cayuga is always a wonderful opportunity to showcase the incredible fishery that exists, in addition to things that we can't necessarily monetize or count. Ecosystem services, we know the lakes are extremely valuable for the spiritual and the aesthetic and the drinking water and all of the amazing, you know, basically things that they do to make us feel good. So it's a wonderful place to be. And certainly from a, you know, beverage perspective and reputation for food and wine, the Finger Lakes is a global brand, as we know. I think the other thing that we'd like to keep in mind for the big picture here is this food, energy, water nexus. So how do we think about, you know, when we're looking at water, we can't just look at water. I'm a systems person. So in addition to water, we also have to look at how food is grown and then all the energy it takes to support all of these things and how they're interconnected with each other. And there's a lot of implications for, basically global boundaries for how much fresh water we have. I mean, we're very fortunate in the Finger Lakes, but we also, have these competing interests for energy and food. And I think also from an economic development perspective, we know that the water is a huge draw, very evidenced by the Micron, basically plants that are going to be built in just north of Syracuse. I mean, water was a big draw for those. So, I mean, water is precious. We're very fortunate to have a lot of it. So with that, I mean, I think we do like to look at what threats are to the Finger Lakes. And for our purposes at the Finger Lakes Institute, we focus a lot on nutrients and land use. We know that nutrients drive the energy flow of a system. When it gets out of balance, we get things like harmful algal blooms. Invasive species are a contributing factor as well that also can influence both nutrient cycling. It can, displace habitats, but also affect contaminants. Contaminants are things like mercury and other pollutants that we need to learn more about. And a lot of these depend on food web changes that have to do with invasive species. And then, we're all trying to look at how do we begin to address these challenges within a watershed management framework. And then, of course, we have climate change, which is impacting all of these things as we try to study it and collect information. So, so it's a very complex thing, and a lot of interrelated questions. I just want to remind everyone, I know this group knows, but we are part of the Great Lakes Basin. We have, yes, so that gives us amazing opportunities to learn from what's happening in the big lakes, but within our own little lakes themselves, the 11 lakes, as a scientist, and I like to refer back to the Burgeon Juday, some of the original published work on the Finger Lakes, at least in the written work here. And, you can look at the different lakes, their watersheds, different physical characteristics, how deep they are. And, basically when they came in, about 110 years ago, I mean, I love this quote, it's probable that there is no group of lakes in the world which offers to the limnologists such opportunities for working out the problems of their science. I mean, these folks came from Madison. That's where I was before I moved back to New York. But New York has a lot going on, and the Finger Lakes are a wonderful place to be a scientist. So when I first started, I did mention that my background is in environmental health, and environmental health takes into a lot of different factors, but we, not only do our own work, but also rely a lot on things like epidemiology and toxicology, psychology, communications. I mean, you can see the stuff that's here, but I really like the idea and the framing of how the spatial scales are also nested and integrated. And, from a systems approach, we're looking at what happens before or upstream and downstream, after. So, just this kind of governs like how, we think about a lot of issues at the FLI. And a big part, particularly when we're looking at things like contaminants or maybe HABs, like why do we care about those issues happening? And, I like to go back to the risk assessment framework here that the EPA has. And I grabbed this, well, I won't even talk about the figure, but luckily I grabbed this about a year ago for another talk. But I mean, we have some figures, but I do believe that the stuff is still current on the website. But really a big part of risk assessment is figuring out what is dangerous, right? Why is it dangerous? How dangerous is it? Dose response, how much do you have to be exposed to something before it causes adverse effects? Big thing that I would say that we do in the Finger Lakes is this exposure assessment. So how are people exposed to the contaminants that we see? And then once you put all of these things together, you get a risk characterization. And research informs a lot of this, but then we also then have ways and, rules in place and how we manage the risk. And these are just iterative cycles, and information should be feeding back and forth from basically, what we're trying to assess to what else do we need to learn about the environment to give us better predictive models. So with that framework in mind, I just want to talk a little bit about harmful algal blooms. I know that this group knows it, but every time I do a talk, I always love to find the new news events or news outlets where some of this, we're actually being mentioned for having a lot of harmful algal blooms. And one from last summer was on CBS New York talking about the Finger Lakes and all the blooms that we have. We know that they obviously impact not only our drinking water, but our ability to recreate in nearshore waters. So we've seen a lot more of these harmful algal blooms over the decades. And again, I know I've used this if you've ever seen a HAB stock that I've given. So we know that there's a lot of HABs in the Finger Lakes, and they've just become more prevalent. We've had more people looking, but we also know that these blooms have toxins associated with them, and that our most vulnerable systems are, basically our drinking water supplies and the recreation and shorelines. The classic HABs images here, and it looks like my credits went away, but this is from the Toledo Blade and some satellite imagery from NOAA, but that is on the right side there, a scoop of Lake Erie water from 2014 that has a lot of microcystis in it, and nobody wants to drink that. And that's a crib that's out in Lake Erie, and that's what the whole water column looked like. These can produce toxins, and that's what we're really trying to understand better, the formation of these and when they go away and how toxic they are. So with that being said, we do have a certified lab at the FLI. We're certified for nutrients and total microcystins. We know that nutrients are a driver in this, and total microcystins help us understand the toxins in the bloom events themselves. And we've pursued some grant funding. We have a number of funded projects from the New York State Water Resources Institute and from the DEC and others, where we've looked at things such as chlorophyll as an indicator for toxin concentrations. And this particular slide is highlighting a collaboration we've had with Cornell, working with Ruth Richardson and Nan Wang, a PhD student of Ruth's in civil and environmental engineering. And what we've tried to look at was not only the presence of HABs in different lakes, and in this case, we primarily looked at Cayuga and Canandaigua, but we also looked at the microbial community that accompanies the algal community of the phytoplankton, which is kind of represented by this bottom left figure. You can see microcystis and you can see dolichospermum here, but there's other little fun things that are in the water too, like other types of phytoplankton. There's Vorticella. So lots of things. It's never just one organism that's part of these communities. And one of the things that we explored with Ruth and Nan and others and our watershed partners, certainly on Cayuga, Seneca, and Canandaigua, is how the relative, amount of microsystem per unit of chlorophyll, because we always use chlorophyll as a screen for trying to understand toxins. And we saw that Canandaigua, actually in this red here, CN is Canandaigua, CY is Cayuga, SC is Seneca. And this is representing different weeks that we sampled in the summertime, starting roughly in, basically August, or I'm sorry, in July, going through the beginning of October. And we see that Canandaigua actually has a higher ratio of chlorophyll, of microcystin to the chlorophyll. And so this compare and contrast across lakes is really, really important to help us understand more about what's happening in individual lakes. When do blooms start in one lake? When do they end? That tells us a lot about, what are some of the drivers of harmful algal blooms in the lakes. We've published some papers, currency for scientists, some papers, certainly with CSI was involved with this first paper on Cayuga Lake. I'm happy to have worked with them as well as with several of Bruce's students. And we have some other work coming. That's Nan's next papers are going to be published soon. And we've also done some work on Owasco Lake and Seneca Lakes related to some of the meteorological drivers of harmful algal blooms. So with that, then I kind of want to go back to this exposure assessment again. Like, how do we expose to HABs? And, one of the things that, another step that we take in environmental health is when we look at exposure pathways, right? So where are the contaminants found and how are people and organisms exposed? So certainly with HABs, we know that they're found in water, they're in surface water, but how do we actually, as humans or organisms, get exposed to the toxins? Well, that's where we start to look at things like ingestion of water. So that's actually drinking water. Inhalation is another pathway. There's some work in some other places that show that might be something we should be paying a little more attention to, but then also the dermal contact with water pollutants. And so kind of with this framework in mind, I just want to pivot now to some of the other work that we've done with fish in the Finger Lakes. And that relates to, not only, emission sources, but, food is a big way that organisms are exposed to contaminants as well. And so in this case, I'm going to talk specifically about fish, freshwater fish in the lakes themselves. So one of the big pushes that we've had at the Finger Lakes Institute is mercury. I've done a lot of work in the Great Lakes and the Everglades on mercury, and started a mercury lab once I came to the FLI. And we've been working with a number of different groups to just basically get fish and do contaminant analysis to have a better understanding of the concentrations and whether we should be concerned with them. This is kind of just we have a lot of students involved with this, and not only are we doing lake work, but we've also done stream work. And mercury is important because it's a neurotoxicant. If you're familiar with Alice in Wonderland and the Mad Hatter, mercury was used in making hats, and mercury is, once you're exposed to it, it can have neurological impacts. And so, this is an example of an experiment that was done with mice that showed some motor impairment with different exposure concentrations. And so the other thing that's important about mercury is where it comes from. So we know it's emitted from burning fossil fuels primarily. And, it kind of travels through the air, gets deposited, can run off into streams and lakes. And there it's converted into an organic form, which is more toxic than the elemental form that, which you usually recognize as quicksilver. And one of the most important things is that mercury can bioaccumulate in a food web. So as a small fish is eaten by a bigger fish, that bigger fish will have a higher concentration of mercury relative to the smaller fish. And so, this food web transfer is a really important aspect of understanding why certain organisms have higher concentrations of contaminants. We've published a number of papers about mercury in the Finger Lakes region. I just want to acknowledge Roxanne Razavi. She was a postdoc here with us in 2015 to 2017, and now she's a professor at SUNY ESF. And when she was here, we had some NYSERDA funding, and we did a lot of kind of update work on the fisheries and mercury contamination or mercury concentrations across the different fish species in the Finger Lakes. And we have published those not only for streams, but for lakes. And with some of the other work, we've been able to put it into context with how does this relate to other work in New York State? How does this relate to terrestrial systems? Things like bats, how are they exposed to mercury? And then also some work with invasive species. So that's just some of our past work, and some of our current work relates to working with Seneca Lake Pure Waters and others on the Seneca Lake or the National Lake Trout Derby. And so we have worked every May there on Memorial Day weekend. There is a fishing tournament related to catching the largest fish on Seneca Lake. That tournament started in 1965. And so we, from Hobart Williams Smith Colleges and SUNY ESF, we got together with Seneca Lake Pure Waters and started, asking anglers when they were bringing their fish in to be weighed, if we could have some pieces of their fish, if in turn for cleaning the fish. This was after it was already weighed and assessed for the contest. And the thing that we have started, we're doing is looking at the diets as well as looking at the contaminant concentrations in them. And one of the really interesting questions, if you look at Cayuga Lake and Seneca Lake, is, until the very recent past, Cayuga Lake had round goby, Seneca Lake didn't. And if we looked at mercury concentrations in lake trout, Seneca Lake was always higher than Cayuga Lake. So one of the questions is round goby one of the responsible organisms, or one reason why the concentrations of mercury are lower in Cayuga Lake trout? And I could refer you back to some of the publications, but we became keenly interested in this because then in 2022, as far as we know, there were not round gobies in Seneca Lake, but in 2023 they were found. And so now we're looking at this. So we work with the anglers, to basically collect as many different stomachs, tissue, as well as other parts of the fish for assessment. And here's a picture of the research team in 2022. There's a couple of Hobart and Williams Smith students on the left. There's a couple of ESF students in the middle, including Eric, who is the PhD student who's working on this, Susan Cushman from the Hobart and Williams Smith, the biology department, and then Roxanne. And it says here that I am not pictured, which I stole this caption from Susan, and I was actually out of town for this particular event, but there might be another reason, and I'll show you in a second. But also want to make sure that we acknowledge our partners on this, Seneca Lake Pure Waters, the National Lake Trout Derby, as well as Stivers Seneca Marine. But here's what that looked like, and this might have been another reason why I wasn't in that slide, is we did these dissections. And so here's some really gnarly fish stomachs and things like that. But on the right picture, you can see the fish head that was collected. You could get the otoliths, so you could age the fish, the guts, and then the fillet that we actually use for contaminants. What did Susan and her students find in the stomachs? They did not only counting the things that they could identify that were in the stomachs, but how much, so the counts as well as the weight. And by far the dominant prey item for the Seneca Lake trout were alewives, which is, nothing. I mean, that's important for us to know, and similar to other, larger lakes. If we start to look at mercury, basically looking at lake trout compared to brown trout, rainbow trout, and landlocked salmon. So these are all salmonids that are also found in the lake. Lake trout tended to have higher concentrations of mercury, but we also had more fish. And this we had fish concentrations from 2022 that are in this figure. We also, from our papers, had fish concentrations from 2015. The good news is that the mercury concentrations aren't really changing very much, at least in that 7-year period. And so at least they're not increasing. We'd like to see them go down a little bit, but they're not changing up very much, at least in Seneca Lake. So another part of this work was doing some PFAS analysis. And so Roxanne and Eric at SUNY ESF did this, and they assessed some of the PFAS chemicals that, are pervasive in our environment. And I think we've all heard a lot about these chemicals. They're referred to as the forever chemicals because they stick around so much, and there's so many different compounds. I believe there's, basically they're found in pretty much many consumer products. They've been around for decades. They're not going away. And there's over 9,000 compounds. So we're trying to understand then, should we be concerned about the presence of these chemicals? And here's a couple of figures. I mean, very similar to the mercury, like where and how PFAS can flow through an ecosystem. And in humans, like what are some of the main target systems, that we should be worried about and that have documented PFAS effects? So certainly, there's just a myriad of different health effects that could potentially happen. And so we're trying to get a better handle on the types of PFAS we're finding in fish, as one of the primary exposure routes for humans. Drinking water is clearly another one. And then we also want to understand more about the relative difference in the specific compounds that we're finding in the fish from different lakes. PFAS, this is very much an emerging topic. This is a map that the Environmental Working Group puts out. You can find it on their website. And I think some of the rules are catching up to reporting, more about PFAS in the environment. And this is a screenshot from last May, as of May 20th, 21st from 2024. And it's just PFAS kind of in New York. And, not every dot on here means that it's a bad dot. It's just like, where have we even looked for information about PFAS? And you'll see that a lot of the places that, particularly in the Finger Lakes, like Ithaca, I just want to point out there is a dot here, but it's because the drinking water was assessed and it's actually below the proposed limit. So that's good. So information, this is what the EWG is just trying to do to get information out. You can see like places like Massachusetts and some of the other places have had a lot more assessments than New York. If you fast forward to this week, New York has, there's been a lot more points added for New York State. And I think we're now starting to get a better idea about some of the drinking water systems that we might want to pay attention to, or what are some of the known contaminations, sites that we might need to address or continue to address, like the Superfund site at the Seneca Army Depot, and other sources that are certainly in our region. And I know that, there's lots of people like Damien's group at Cornell is doing a lot of this work, and did a lot of survey of streams around the Finger Lakes. We're continually, when we were able to collect some water with Seneca Lake Pure Waters last summer to do some stream assessments, we also did some fish collections, and we're going to be sharing that information with the investigators at Cornell. So trying to get a better handle on this PFAS question. And then just want to kind of close with one of our recently published papers on PFAS from the Lake Trout Derby. And I know that I can't go on about this for the rest of the evening. So I love the aspects of journals these days, and they ask for graphical abstracts. And I do think a picture is worth 1,000 words. So first of all, I want to point out that Eric is the lead author on this paper. In addition to our HWS folks, we had a lot of DEC people. And we also worked with Jacques Rincard at SUNY Brockport. He does a lot of work on fatty acids. And, we know that fish is good food for us. Essential fatty acids can really help us with cognitive function and everything else. So the big thing of environmental health, I think, is trying to get information out to consumers so that we can make educated and informed decisions about what's best for our individual or our families or our communities. So there's always, this information, I think, needs to be looked at in a big picture. And so some of the major conclusions that we found, at least for PFAS, similar to mercury, is that we saw, this is the sum of all the PFAS, so all the different compounds that were analyzed. Lake trout had higher concentrations than the other salmonids that were assessed as part of the Seneca Lake Trout Derby. And then the different types of, so basically the sum of PFAS found in fish and lake trout and Seneca Lake was actually less than Lake Ontario and Lake Erie, the most industrialized of the Great Lakes. but some of the PFAS compounds of a certain nature, they found more of them in Seneca Lake. And, you know, the hypothesis is this related to the firefighting foams, the aqueous firefighting foams that have been used like at military installations, and found potential, you know, that it's definitely associated with the Seneca Army Depot. So another just graph, and I'm not going to spend any time, but I do want to show that Cayuga Lake fish were also assessed in this. This was the DEC and some of the sampling that they've done. And of the different PFAS compounds, you know, PFOS is typically what is the highest, you know, group that you're going to find in the PFAS group, the compounds. Seneca Lake and Cayuga Lake are really not distinguishable from each other, but definitely lower than Lake Ontario and Lake Erie. And then you can look at the other types of compounds. And if anybody, you know, there's paper information there, happy to share a manuscript with anybody. But this is the type of work that we're doing. And then I just want to end with like one other extension that we're doing with our stream work. And we've been doing some work around the landfills and some of the streams. And so kind of looking up, and then just north of Cayuga Lake, looking at Black Brook, which is flowing right near the Seneca Meadows landfill, as well as, you know, Reeder Creek, which is by Seneca Army Depot, and then Catherine Creek, which, you know, is down south in the beautiful part of the Cayuga Lake watershed and Seneca Lake watershed. I did that for you, Roxy and Isaac. But you know, these small fish are really good indicators of local point sources in these smaller streams. And so there's a lot that we can learn by, you know, we go out and take water samples, we're capturing a snapshot. You go out and collect a small fish, you do some contaminant analysis. And even though you can have metabolism and things like that, they're integrating over a much longer period of time, and they give a better picture as to what's happening, you know, basically over a couple of year period. And so very valuable biomonitoring information for us to understand where these exposures are happening. So with that, just want to, you know, just remind us all that water resources and natural capital are the economic heart of our region. There's many pressing issues that we address: HABs, invasive species, nutrients. And I think the last one, I mean, the last couple, I mean, knowing information about one lake is great. Being able to put it in context with other lakes is really, really important. And so that's some of the work that we try to do. And partners are a huge part, you know, are a huge piece of everything that we do. And we really like to work with agencies and make sure some of the word about this research gets out. So we appreciate the evening tonight, the opportunity to share this. And this is my favorite March picture from Cayuga Lake, looking out when all the birds were back a couple of weeks ago. So love Cayuga Lake and the beauty that it provides, and all the wonderful enjoyment that we all get to share together. So thank you for the opportunity to present, and happy to field any questions.
Thank you, Lisa. That's amazing. Yeah, Tony, go ahead.
Yeah, Lisa, thank you very much for your report. And you know, I just recently finished reading Planet Aqua by Jeremy Rifkin, and he talks a lot about the food, energy, water nexus, and essentially how civilization has had it wrong for 6,000 years. A pretty grand statement, by focusing on land use and exploitation, but how we've exploited water is probably much more profound, especially when we look at the nexus that he describes. Question I have for you: with the EPA under attack, how do you think that's going to affect your work? I mean, we've got a lot of great people, the Community Science Institute, the Watershed Network, of course, CWIO. How do you see what may be a pretty devastating blow against the EPA and the work that you're doing?
You're muted, Lisa.
Good, because you didn't hear those expletives that I said to begin the whole statement, right? Um, so, I mean, of course, we're all disheartened with what's happening. It's hard to see, as Roxy was talking about at the beginning, going back to the beginning of EPA and how important, like a lot of the landmark legislation that happened in the 70s and why we should all be like the fact that that was put forth under President Nixon, after the Cuyahoga River and, after Silent Spring and all of the things that Love Canal, we can just kind of go down the list of the environmental catastrophes that we witnessed in our own backyards. And so I am very disheartened that they would, I guess that the federal government would go backwards on these things. I mean, it's exactly a lot of the, for we're thinking of Great Lakes communities, backsliding was one of the things that they said we should never do with the environment. We should always be moving forward. I mean, obviously the funding, I think funding has been hard to get for a long time for any environmental work, especially for any full scale monitoring programs. I mean, they do a lot of this for the Great Lakes. I do believe that a lot of that stuff will continue to be funded because of, the states that are involved in the GLRI and a lot of the political capital of the industrial community. I think also, and I taught environmental science last semester, and I talked to my students 2 days after the election because I had a Tuesday, Thursday class. And I do think that businesses, I mean, obviously there's a lot of people that will go forth and try to exploit the environment, but businesses have made a lot of changes because of things like climate change. And it really isn't in their best financial interest to go backwards and take away all of the changes that have been made to make things more efficient. So I'm certainly not happy about it, but I'm also, it's like we have to push forward. There's no other choice in this. And there's a lot of really great people, a lot of creative ways to get work done. Money always helps, but it's not the only thing. And I'm really glad that there's a lot of lawyers out there. That's all I can say. As a scientist, I remember when I was in Ann Arbor at graduate school, I worked at the National Wildlife Federation, and I took a class with, it was like scientists and attorneys, and we worked together. And it was amazing how lawsuits, I mean, assuming that our courts are still, of course, working, then that's a whole nother assumption. I understand that right now. But, if those things fall, then I think we all have bigger problems to address.
Well, I'll ask another doomy question then while we're at it. Do you still eat fish out of Seneca or Cuba Lake?
I'm careful about the fish that I eat. I mean, there are ways to reduce your risk, right? Fish have great health, benefits. You can always eat lower on the food web, right? So you don't always want to eat the oldest and a fish like mercury, you can't cut the contaminant out because mercury accumulates in fillets or mussel. Some contaminants go to fish skin. You can cut the skin off. But if you eat lower on the food web and eat smaller fish that are still legal, I think there's a lot of great health benefits.
Great, thanks. There's a lot of Finger Lakes fish in my freezer.
Excellent. I can imagine that there is.
I know, right? Other questions for Lisa? Well, that's a whole bunch of work I didn't even know you were doing. That's amazing stuff. Really excited to hear about it. Can't wait to read about every single thing you posted up there. And with that, may we have your talk? We post the talks on our website.
Sure,
That's
of course.
Great,
Yep.
thank you.
Yep.
And then may I plagiarize from your talk next time? I'm trying to be more succinct about how economically important our water is to us here, to those who care more about that in my letters.
Absolutely. I mean, I think we are getting, more information out about that. I mean, we always take it from the economic development, consultants. They publish a report. but there's a lot of compelling information out there and a lot of other places that have recognized how important water is for their, their economy. So,
Yeah, the more we get that message out, the safer we'll be, I think. All right, last chance. No questions? I just can't wait to look at the talk again. All right, Lisa, well, you are welcome to stay with us through Isaac's report, but you're not compelled to.
all right. Thank you so much.
Thank
All right.
you.
Good night.
Bye. All right then, folks, that was a lot of new and very cool information. I think we have some reading to do.